Thank you, Rabbi Shana Tova, everybody. The honor is all mine. I am so excited to be here and to share my work with you. I really want to be there in person. The downside is I can't be, but the positive side is I get to show off. The reason why I am not is I have a beautiful 3-month-old Riley at home, and I get to spend a little bit of Rosh Hashanah here. And so she's going to be my emotional support during the speech. Thank you. So before I begin, I'm actually going to ask you all to do a little bit of work. I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and just for a minute or two, talk about what a home is. What a home is. I'm going to give you 1 or 2 minutes. What a home is. Go for it. All right. If we were in person, it would be more engaging, a lot of activities. Because this is Temple Beth Avodah, I'm going to guess that more than a few of you got philosophical very quickly about what a home is. And at a basic level, a home is a set of walls and a roof, a kitchen and a bedroom. But a home is also where you eat and where you sleep. It's where you get ready for work, where you keep your medicine and go to the bathroom. And a home is a feeling. It is safety and security, family connections, warmth, and relaxation. And so while we talk about youth homelessness today, which is literally the lack of a consistent place to sleep at night, I want you to think about these other things. Because to experience homelessness is to lose all of these other things. Now, I love what I do. And I also love bringing amazing people like you all into my world. Temple Beth Avodah is filled with some of the most incredible people. And I know that this is a community capable of affecting significant change. And so I have committed, as the rabbi said, to working with the TBA community all year on social action and to challenge you to join me and the rabbi in that year-long effort to learn about and then take action in the fight to end youth and young adult homelessness in Greater Boston. So what is it that I do that I love so much? Every day, I work with stakeholders around the country to prevent and end youth and young adult homelessness. And when I talk about youth and young adults, I am talking specifically about young people under the age of 25. That may include an individual who's 10 or 15 or 21. It also includes couples or partners who are surviving together, so like a 16 and a 17-year-old, a 20 and a 22-year-old, and it includes young parents. So it could be a 17-year-old single mom, a 24-year-old single dad with a young child, as long as no one in the household is 25 or older. And when I talk about homelessness, I mean young people who are on the streets or places not meant for sleeping, like a car or a bus terminal, an abandoned building, or under a bridge. Young people living in shelters or other homelessness housing. Young people who are couch surfing, and so when they're moving from place to place and they never know where they will go next or how long they can stay in any one place. And finally, young people living in unsafe situations, fleeing domestic violence, mental and physical abuse, sexual or commercial exploitation. And so I work with cities and counties and states, including the state of Massachusetts, helping them to develop strategic plans to prevent and end youth and young adult homelessness. I coach their leadership, I train their staff, I conduct formal needs assessments. I help them incorporate young people into decision-making structures as full partners and to start youth action boards. And I also work on innovative projects, so things that bring new and promising strategies that I believe in and evidence suggests will help to move the field forward. I love what I do for at least 4 reasons, some of which I hope will resonate with you. So the first is the youth and young adults experiencing homelessness that I get to work with. These are the most intelligent, compassionate, creative, resilient, and inspiring people I have ever met. They have made every project I have ever worked on better. Their insights are searing. And it is amazing to watch them develop into formidable leaders themselves. They are also the most humble and magnanimous people I have ever met, which is probably the most inspiring aspect. Several years ago, I had the privilege to attend the college graduation of a young man that I had mentored. And after the ceremony, I asked him what he wanted to do with his life. He was actually headed to law school. And he said, Matt, I want to make sure that every young person is as lucky as I was. Now, this is a young person who experienced homelessness most of his life, experienced physical and mental trauma. He even lived out of his car for a time while in college, and I was mad because he didn't tell me. And I said to Anthony, what do you mean lucky? If anyone could say that they did it on their own, it would be you. But he said, no, Matt, you don't understand. I found Sasha Bruce, which is the youth organization he worked with. I found this person and that mentor and you. I'm lucky. And there are many more young people who are just as smart and deserving as me who never had those opportunities. And man, do I find that inspiring. The second reason I love what I do is that it just feels right to help people every day. And I consider that a privilege, that I feel this way, that I owe at least in part to growing up at Temple Beth Avodah. I had amazing role models in my grandparents, my Nana who's watching, my parents, and my Auntie Bunny, who were always volunteering as greeters and ushers, building the sukkah with the Brotherhood, supporting every play, event, and blood drive. They were on the school board. They were in temple leadership. Like most of your families, for the folks who are watching today, we participated with the community and food drives. We had tzedakah boxes. I remember raising money during Passover for the candy sales that we did in Hebrew school. And the extra stories in the prayer books that I used to read, the poems and psalms, the sermons from Rabbi, all were about mitzvah, tzedakah, and tikkun olam. And so these are the foundational values that I'm lucky to say were normalized for me in our community. And so now they just feel right, and they make my job that much more satisfying. The third reason is I get to use the skills and talents that I have and enjoy. The community organizing and relationship building I learned as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine, the facilitation skills I learned as a teacher and coach. I get to problem solve and help communities tell their stories. And as often as I can, I still try to work one-on-one with young people. And the great thing about this work is that there is room for a broad range of skills and backgrounds, not just social workers, housing or healthcare specialists. And I can promise that there is a need for your skills and talents in this movement. Finally, I love working on a big challenge with a sense of urgency. Now, that is also something that keeps me up at night, along with my 3-month-old daughter. Thanks to comprehensive and groundbreaking research conducted a few years ago, we know that pre-pandemic, 1 out of 10 18 to 24-year-olds and 1 out of 30 13 to 17-year-olds experience some form of homelessness in America each year. I want to let that sink in for a sec. 1 out of 10 18 to 24-year-olds and 1 out of 30 13 to 17-year-olds experience some form of homelessness in the wealthiest country in the world. That means about 4.2 million young people experience homelessness in America. And if we translate that to Massachusetts, it's between 70 and 90,000. And in Newton and South Brookline, that means it's between 1,200 and 1,500. And even if we think our community is 2 or even 4 times better than the national average, that still means that hundreds of young people experience homelessness in this community every year. And that was before the pandemic, which we don't even know the full effects of yet. After talking about this with my dad last night, it reminded him how shocked he was when he learned that while volunteering with the Boys and Girls Club in Newtonville, he was working with young people experiencing homelessness. Some other things that we know are that there's no difference in the prevalence of youth homelessness, youth and young adult homelessness between urban, suburban, and rural spaces. It sometimes looks different. You may have more couch surfing, for example, in Newton or Brookline because we don't have youth shelters or youth homelessness services. And so you'll see that experience where the few shelters are in Boston or Cambridge or Framingham. We also know that homelessness affects certain populations disproportionately and more severely than average. LGBTQ young people and Black and brown young people are vastly overrepresented, as are young people with histories of child welfare and juvenile justice involvement. We know that young people in poverty and without a high school diploma and young parents are at greater risk, that we are serving lots of young people with histories of domestic violence, or trafficking. And we know that even though the average young person we see in our homelessness system, so those young people who actually receive services, are over 20, they report their first experience with homelessness as occurring before they were 18. And so it means that homelessness starts young, and we usually don't see them until they've already had significant homelessness experience. Now, the consequences of homelessness can be severe. So living on the streets is maybe obvious, and frequently moving risks sexual and physical violence and trauma. According to one report, young people experiencing homelessness have higher rates of PTSD than veterans. They are more than 5 times more likely to experience suicidal ideation or attempt suicide. They're more likely to be trafficked. Homelessness leads to lower graduation rates and school performance. It's hard to find a job and keep a job. It's harder to stay healthy. They're at risk for addiction after using substances as a coping mechanism while experiencing homelessness, and they're at risk of early death. Another recent research initiative estimated that each day a young person experiences homelessness or is waiting in limbo for a resource to become available, which can take many months, that increases their risk of future homelessness by 2% each day, suggesting that today's young people experiencing homelessness may become tomorrow's older folks chronically experiencing homelessness. And even if that is not compelling for you, in the wealthiest country in the world, homelessness unresolved is very expensive. In emergency services and other community resources, it's expensive, as well as in the lost productivity and creativity that those young people may have otherwise added to the world. And yet, despite that daunting, angering, and somewhat bleak picture that I just painted for you, perhaps made significantly worse by the pandemic, I have found a lot of reasons to be hopeful for our movement. 10 years ago, we knew very little about youth and young adult homelessness. Thanks to investments from the government and private philanthropy, we now have a detailed understanding of the problem and are building an evidence base for which solutions actually make a difference. While it is nowhere near enough, there is more funding for youth and young adult homelessness every year at the federal, state, and local levels. The state of Massachusetts has actually stepped up pretty well for the last 5 years in making meaningful, flexible investments in community efforts to end youth and young adult homelessness. I also think that we are more aware of youth and young adult homelessness than we ever have been, about the housing crisis in general, as well as systemic issues like racism and homophobia that contribute to homelessness. And that has brought in more people in sectors than we ever had. So not just traditional homelessness folks, but schools and colleges, first responders, child welfare and criminal justice, businesses, and philanthropy. And finally, I'm hopeful because of the number of young people with lived experience leading the movement. 2 of them run the largest national campaign to end youth and young adult homelessness. It's called Away Home America. There are more youth action boards in every community around the country than ever, and they are beginning to take over roles at all levels of the work. So where do you all fit in? What is the role of Temple Beth Avodah in all of this, as Rabbi was alluding to? The first thing is we can build our awareness. We can confront stereotypes and commit to paying attention and taking an active role. Youth and young adult homelessness is way too easy to ignore in our country. Frequently, I ask people during sessions that I lead to tell me what they think of immediately after I say the word homeless. And they usually talk about an older man living on the streets, drunk or high, and begging for money. And they say it with a lack of empathy and deservedness. And to be honest, I have those same preconceived notions. While it is far from the norm, homelessness can look like that. And that person is every bit as deserving of a home as anyone else. Homelessness on average looks very different. It is far more often a single mom in her early 20s with 1 to 3 young children who works or is looking for work. And it is a lack of community connections and many, many failed systems that lead to a terrible fate that is tough to get out of. It is something that we need to confront and can do something about. And that's why Rabbi and I talked about us first doing a lot of learning together this year. Next, we can take time to consider our own skills, roles, capacities, and interests. As I mentioned, we have this amazing community. We are doctors and professors, politicians and entrepreneurs. We've got engineers and journalists and our amazing young people. And everyone has something that is valuable to the movement. We can volunteer our time at local food banks or the Y2Y Youth Shelter in Harvard Square. We can mentor young people either one-on-one or as part of a program that builds permanent connections. We can contribute our legal advice to young people who need help with documentation or evictions. Businesses can work with employment organizations to hire young people. We can create media that brings awareness and challenges stereotypes. We can champion state legislation and local ordinances that create housing and fight against NIMBYism and those laws that criminalize homelessness. And we can use our development expertise to build units and rent to this population. For those of you who are philanthropists or who would like to donate in any amount, there are plenty of important opportunities for investment in our community. Now, generally, I think about investments in three categories. You can fund more of what exists, you can fund efficiency and improvements, and you can fund innovation. There are lots of worthy organizations that need our support. They are doing incredible work, and I donate to many of them every single year. We need massive investments in housing programs and services. And not only is that a great role for government to play, we will not end youth and young adult homelessness by doing what we are already doing and expecting a different result. Now, I spend most of my days in the efficiency and improvement space, helping communities build better systems, collaborate new ways, increase staff capacity, standardize and streamline processes. And while that can take communities a long, long way, I am a true believer in what we call the coordinated community response. Eventually, you can only be so coordinated and so efficient. So to end youth and young adult homelessness, a challenge in its most recent incarnation that has been with us since the 1980s and in its modern form since at least the 1500s, we need new and innovative strategies that will help us shift from managing youth and young adult homelessness to ending it. And this is also the best space for private philanthropy and public-private partnerships, especially when it is focused on areas that the field has identified as underserved. So I want to just give you one important example that I'm involved with, and it addresses a few of the things that I've talked about today. How important it is to get youth and young adults the help they need quickly, include flexibility to meet their diverse needs, address issues of youth empowerment and equity, and be efficient with our resources to serve a heck of a lot more young people than we are today. BayCash is a direct cash transfer program for youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. Some of you may be familiar with cash transfer projects. There was one in Stockton, California. There's even one in Chelsea, Mass. There will be one in Cambridge. This is something like that, but more substantial and longer lasting. I have been working on this for over a year now with partners like the United Way and Y2Y, the state's Executive Office of Health and Human Services, and even my mom, who is a board member of the initiative, which has been fabulous. We are going to test whether regular modest cash payments over 2 years' time, plus targeted supports like peer navigation and financial coaching, are effective in ending youth and young adult homelessness. If I had one tool to add to the toolkit of every community in America, it would be direct cash transfers, no question. While there are no silver bullets, this could be the most important intervention in our fight to prevent and end youth and young adult homelessness. But it doesn't exist yet anywhere in the United States for this population. There is another pilot on the way in New York City that I'm a part of, but no one else is doing it yet. That is despite the overwhelming evidence that direct cash transfers are effective in improving a broad array of outcomes for people with the highest barriers to success. It is one of the most well-researched interventions in the world, but in America, there are a few biases and cultural aspects that get in the way. We don't like giving money to people. We don't usually trust poor people. We don't tend to trust Black and brown people. We don't trust young people, and we don't trust folks experiencing homelessness. I have these same unconscious biases too, because I grew up in this country as well. And that's a lot to overcome, including the belief that money will just be wasted. But all of the evidence that we can find has said the opposite, that when you give poor folks money unconditionally through a cash transfer program, they spend it on their basic needs. They spend it on food and clothing, on housing and healthcare, debts and education. They don't waste it any more than any other human being. and likely less than well-resourced folks do. I certainly can think of several times over the past month that I made a poor financial decision. And what's more, cash transfers allow young people to meet their needs quickly by convincing maybe a relative to let them live with them, or for a little rent to find a roommate quickly, rather than spending the 3 or 6 or sometimes 9-month average waits to move into a housing unit once you've already qualified for a program, all the time increasing your risk of future homelessness. It allows us to spend the funding on young people's individual needs without red tape or irrelevant spending prescriptions. It builds youth and young adult self-efficacy through trust and practice, and allows them to avoid some of the implicit racism, homophobia, and transphobia by removing middlemen and gatekeepers between them and their needs. And it's way more cost-effective to run a direct cash transfer program, even with the offered supports, than a traditional housing program. And so we can serve a lot more young people. But to make this sustainable, to overcome those biases that I mentioned, we really need evidence. Direct cash transfers have actually come in and out of fashion several times in this country over the last 150 years. Basic income was thought to be all but inevitable by economists in the early 20th century. Richard Nixon, if any of you have been around long enough, almost signed universal basic income into law in the early 1970s. And we have had several other generous cash transfer programs come and go as their momentum has waned. And so we are building in rigorous evaluation to Bay Cash by running a random controlled trial. This is the gold standard of evaluations. So that when we are done, I can go to the State House and to cities and towns and tell them this works with a high level of confidence, and you need to make this available for the long term for the young people who want it. Unfortunately, there is a catch. In order to run a random controlled trial that returns results with a high level of statistical significance, I won't get into all the numbers, which are way over my head anyways, you need to start big. You need to serve a lot of young people. So we can't start with a small pilot of just a handful of youth and young adults. And this means we need, in order to convince public entities to make a significant investment in the future, we need to work with private philanthropy to raise a lot of money to conduct a pilot that will return us those significant results. And if you are interested in Bay Cash after hearing this, please come and find me and my mom, Risa, because I would love to tell you more about this and get you involved. Now, there are several other initiatives and innovative efforts that I love and think are critical for our field, particularly those in the mental health space, where we need to reach people consistently in ways that help evade stigma and are culturally competent, and in the permanent connection space, where young people can build non-clinical, lifelong relationships with people in their community who will help them to sustain successful lives. And I really look forward to exploring each of those with all of you during the coming year. Over the next few weeks, I will be working with Rabbi and the Temple Beth Avodah staff to schedule opportunities for the community, including our Temple's youth groups, to engage in this work that I really do love so much. We hope to set up opportunities for both learning and action, and I would strongly encourage you to join us. If anything, I hope that a little bit of my love and passion have rubbed off on you today, that some of it resonated with you and maybe even inspired you to get involved yourself. If even a handful of us come together, we are sure to make a significant difference. Thank you so much. Shana Tova, this has really been a special honor to share my work with you. Thank you.